When the world saw Hitler die in a burning Berlin bunker, it thought the nightmare was over. But death, it seems, cannot bury a name. For those who shared his blood, the nightmare had only begun. Children, siblings, nephews, all marked, all hunted by whispers, suspicion, and fear. Every door they knocked on, every passport they signed, carried the invisible chains of a dictator's legacy. Neighbors recoiled. Friends disappeared. Letters returned unopened. Even oceans could not hide them from history's judgment. Some changed their names, some fled continents, some vanished into silence. Yet wherever they went, shadows followed. Shadows of guilt, shame, and a curse that refused to die. This is not a story of Hitler's crimes. This is a story of those who were forced to live with them. The bloodline that survived, only to be haunted by a name that no one could escape. This is the story of a family cursed before birth and condemned long after the Führer fell. The Third Reich had collapsed, its towers of tyranny reduced to rubble and ashes. Europe exhaled, weary and broken, yet some burdens would not fade with smoke. Among the ruins, in quiet streets and hidden corners, a new kind of prisoner walked free, those bound not by chains, but by blood. The Hitler family, once strangers to the world outside Braunau, now carried a weight heavier than any soldier or civilian had ever known. Adolf Hitler was dead, yet death had no mercy for the living who shared his blood. Each name whispered across continents became a mark, each photograph a relic of a past too terrible to confront. Paula, the sister, lived in Austria under a false identity. She never entered a social gathering without checking the faces around her, searching for judgment, suspicion, or recognition. Every step she took reminded her of her brother's shadow, growing longer with every year. The streets she walked were empty in her mind, crowded only with ghosts who whispered blame and hatred. Alois, the younger brother, fled Germany entirely. Ireland became his refuge, a place where he could cook, serve beer, and pretend that history had no claim on him. Customers called him polite. Neighbors called him quiet. Yet within him, the echoes of a name that had caused death for millions never ceased. Each day was a careful calculation. Avoid attention, avoid questions, avoid the past that would not release him. Even William Patrick, the nephew, found no solace in America. Though Long Island offered him ordinary life, the shadow of his family name hovered over him like smoke. He planted gardens, fished in rivers, and mended cars, simple tasks meant to distract, to heal. But the world had not forgotten, and in every conversation, in every passing glance, he felt the weight of history pressing down. And it was not just strangers who carried judgment. Letters from distant cousins, inquiries from distant reporters, and even casual whispers in cafes reminded them that blood was an inheritance they never asked for. They could change their names, relocate across oceans, vanish into the crowd, but the name would find them. And it was a name that bore the weight of murder, terror, and global catastrophe. The burden of living under a shadow is unlike any prison. It is silent, invisible, yet suffocating. One cannot see it, touch it, or lock it away. And for the Hitler family, this shadow stretched across continents, following them into exile, into new homes, into fleeting moments of false comfort. No ceremony could cleanse them. No apology could release them. They were condemned not for what they did, but for what they carried in their veins. And as decades passed, each step they took was measured against a past they could never escape. The world assumed Hitler's death had ended his tyranny, but for those bound by blood, the nightmare continued. They were forced into anonymity, into isolation, into the cruel arithmetic of guilt by inheritance. And within this silence, every breath was haunted by the weight of a single question. Could one live, truly live, when the world refused to forget who you were? This is not the story of Adolf Hitler. It is the story of those who shared his lineage, who bore his curse and who survived, only to carry his shadow across decades, continents, and generations. Even as the years slipped by, the shadow of Adolf Hitler clung to those who shared his blood. William Patrick, Alexander, and Louis, the surviving nephews, tried to live ordinary lives. They mowed lawns, painted fences, and tinkered with engines. The world outside might have seemed indifferent, but within each moment, the weight of legacy pressed down. Every smile, every word, every handshake reminded them of a name that had brought death to millions. They avoided schools, military service, and social gatherings. Every potential connection was a risk, a question too probing, a glance too long, a whispered curiosity about the past. They had a pact. None of them would have children. The Hitler bloodline would end quietly, without fanfare, without the world knowing. It was their penance, their secret justice, their way of ensuring that evil could not be reborn through them. Across the ocean, Alois in Ireland remained haunted by his brother's ghost in his own conscience. He kept meticulous notes, never spoke of politics, never allowed photographs of his family in the tavern. He lived under a mask, performing the ordinary while internally tallying the cost of being born into a name that had changed the course of history. Paula's life in Austria was a study in quiet torment. The people she met saw only a secretary with a polite smile, but in her mind every face was a judge. Every street was a reminder of where she had come from. Every year a reminder of the horrors that her brother had orchestrated. She survived not because she was strong, but because she had mastered silence, hiding her grief and her fear in plain sight. Letters, photographs, and rare interviews revealed the depth of their suffering. Each document was a relic, a small window into lives constrained not by law but by reputation and inherited guilt. Even when history moved on, when newspapers ceased to speak of Hitler's relatives, the curse lingered. It lived in whispers, in subtle gestures, in the avoidance of eye contact when strangers guessed at their identities. By the 1960s, the bloodline had effectively ended. William Patrick died childless, Alexander never married, and Louis lived a solitary life in quiet despair. Paula's grave remained nameless, Alois's tavern faded into history, the nephews' houses scattered across the continents. And yet, the shadow persisted, a reminder that sometimes the sins of the past are not in the deeds themselves, but in the memory of those who carry them. The Führer's death may have closed a chapter of terror in Berlin, but for those linked by blood, history was a continuous sentence. Each breath taken in anonymity was a struggle against remembrance. Each day survived a testament to human endurance under the weight of inherited shame. And so, they walked on, silent, unseen, but forever haunted. The world assumed evil had died with its architect. They knew otherwise. Decades passed and Alois remained hidden, a ghost among ordinary lives. His tavern flourished modestly, a safe haven for locals, yet it was also a cage. Each smile, each greeting, each gesture of hospitality carried a weight, the invisible chains of a name that had defined him before he could even speak. He became adept at evasion, mastering silence as a shield. Conversations about politics, war, or family history were met with vague nods, laughter that never reached his eyes, and deliberate shifts of the subject. One rainy afternoon in the late 1950s, the delicate veil of anonymity began to fray. A visiting journalist, aware of whispers about Hitler's extended family, asked subtle questions, probing, careful, trying to penetrate the armor Alois had built. The man behind the bar paused, his hand tightening on the beer mug. For a moment, the practiced smile faltered. His eyes, usually so steady, flickered with the memory of names, events, and atrocities he had never committed but could never escape. He spoke softly, almost a whisper, as if the words themselves could summon shadows. "My name has caused enough death," he said. "Please, let it die." Those few words, laden with guilt and exhaustion, were the closest Alois would ever come to confession. No grand speeches, no justifications, only a silent acknowledgement that history's weight was not a burden of choice but of birthright. The journalist pressed on, seeking photographs, interviews, proof of lineage. Alois politely refused, retreating further into his silence. He moved through his life like a man underwater, the world moving around him while he floated in the heavy currents of remembrance and denial. His sleep was haunted by images of Europe ablaze, by shadows of his brother's decisions, by the faces of people he would never meet, but whose deaths haunted every corner of his consciousness. In the evenings, he would sometimes walk along the cliffs near the town, staring at the grey sea stretching into infinity. The waves broke like murmured whispers of a past he could neither erase nor embrace. He reflected on his choice to sever ties with family, to abandon any possibility of a legacy. In his mind, the bloodline was a contagion of guilt, and he refused to continue it. Alois had chosen erasure over inheritance, solitude over notoriety. When he passed in the late 1960s, He left behind no heirs, no markers of his existence beyond the crumbling tavern. Neighbors would recall the polite, quiet man who once smiled faintly behind the bar, but vanished as silently as a shadow at dusk. The world forgot Alois Hitler, yet in that very forgetfulness, he achieved a strange immortality, a life defined not by action, but by the silent, deliberate choice to let a name die quietly. In the archives of history, his life remains an annotation, a whisper beneath the roar of global events. A man born into infamy, who chose obscurity. His story, though muted, speaks volumes about guilt, legacy, and the impossible burden of carrying a name too heavy for one life to bear. The Atlantic crossed their path like a silent divider between the old world and the new. William, Patrick, Alexander, and Louis arrived in Long Island with nothing but small suitcases, letters of immigration, and an unspoken fear that the shadow of their surname might follow them across oceans. They rented modest homes on quiet streets, blending in with fishermen, gardeners, and mechanics, men who had never heard of their family, who never would. Each day was ordinary, almost painfully so. William tended a small vegetable garden behind a white picket fence, the sun hitting the green leaves like a fragile promise of life. Alexander fixed engines in a local garage, hands always greasy, face always smudged with the evidence of labor, as if hard work could scrub away inherited guilt. Louis spent hours on the docks, watching the waves lap against the pier, waiting for the horizon to swallow him whole. But normalcy was a fragile illusion. The moment a stranger asked about their background, the three froze, words catching in their throats. The question alone, "Who is your family?" was enough to remind them of a name that had wrought more destruction than any man could bear. Even among friends who believed them to be ordinary men, there was a tension, an unspoken knowledge that one misstep could shatter the delicate camouflage they had so carefully crafted. At night, in the privacy of their homes, the three gathered in quiet rooms. Maps of the world, photographs of distant relatives, and letters unopened for decades were spread across tables. It was here, in these moments of seclusion, that the pact was formed. "It ends with us," one whispered. A vow taken not lightly, not out of malice, but out of moral responsibility. None would marry. None would bear children. The Hitler bloodline, the legacy of infamy, would cease to exist by their hands alone. The weight of this decision pressed upon them constantly. Gardening, fishing, fixing engines, these were not hobbies but distractions, rituals designed to keep guilt at bay. Every handshake, every neighborly smile was measured against the shadow of history. They were living as ordinary men, yet haunted by an extraordinary curse, the knowledge that a single birth could reignite a chain of infamy they could never forgive themselves for. Even simple joys were tinged with apprehension. A fishing trip meant laughter, yet laughter was an echo of the past, a reminder that the world might never let them escape. Fixing a car, watching it roar to life, felt like a minor rebellion against inherited destiny, a small act of creation in defiance of the destruction their name had caused. Years passed, and the pact held. Neighbors came and went, friends were made and lost, but no children were born into this haunted lineage. Silence became their legacy, as much as the shadows that followed them. Letters went unopened. Calls were avoided. The world could not touch them, and yet the past remained like a coiled serpent waiting. In private, they sometimes spoke in whispers, reminding one another the pact was not a punishment, but a shield. The burden of guilt was theirs alone, yet they carried it in solidarity. Three men bound by blood, yet determined to end it. In ending the line, they hoped to end the cycle of infamy and allow the world, and perhaps themselves, a measure of redemption. Even today, historians studying the Hitler family note the quiet power of this pact, an act of destruction that paradoxically preserved the world from a continuation of the same bloodline. It was not vengeance nor heroism, but a moral calculation, a line drawn through history with the ink of conscience and the weight of shame. Time passed, but the pact was never forgotten. Each morning as the sun rose over Long Island, William, Alexander, and Louis awoke to the quiet weight of a promise that stretched far beyond the ordinary. It was not enough to live simply, to blend into anonymity. They had to remind themselves constantly that their blood carried a history that demanded vigilance. William would sip coffee on the porch, the steam rising like a ghostly veil, thinking of grandchildren he would never have. Alexander in the garage paused mid-wrench turn, imagining a life he refused to create, a life that might carry the same infamy as the name they bore. Louis would watch the harbor, the waves echoing the endless rhythm of memory and regret, feeling the pulse of a past that would not die quietly. Visitors and neighbors often commented on their polite manners, their quiet dedication to work, their avoidance of small talk. But behind the polite smiles and ordinary routines, there was always tension, an unspoken alertness. Any mention of Germany, of war, or of a name could bring the carefully maintained illusion crashing down. They were prisoners of history even on American soil, forced to carry a guilt that had never been theirs to commit, yet theirs to contain. The pact itself became ritual. It was spoken not in public, but in whispered affirmations during quiet nights. It ends with us. Each repetition was a solemn act, a binding chain forged by conscience rather than law. They were not saints nor heroes, merely men who chose sacrifice over comfort. Their lives, stripped of the possibility of continuation, became a testament to morality in a world where history had been stained by monstrous ambition. Friends and neighbors sensed something peculiar about the trio, though they never guessed the depth. They were too ordinary to be remarkable, yet too haunted to be fully at peace. Children, weddings, family gatherings, all remained distant fantasies, reminders of what was intentionally forsaken. And as decades passed, the weight of absence became an unspoken presence, a living memorial to the curse they carried silently. Even in their final years, the nephews spoke rarely of their decision. The pact was no longer just a promise. It was identity. To break it would have been to summon the specters of history, to unleash a continuation of the shadow they had vowed to contain. They were alone yet together, bound by blood, burdened by legacy, and protected by silence. Their deaths were quiet, unmarked, and uncelebrated. Historians, piecing together the fragments of their lives, often commented not on fame or wealth, but on the extraordinary moral weight carried by ordinary men. The Hitler bloodline ended, not by the world's hand, but by its own careful, deliberate choice. And in that ending lay a strange form of redemption, a hope that some evils can be halted, not by force but by conscience. Even today, the pact stands as a haunting lesson. The most profound acts of courage are not always loud or heroic. Sometimes they are small, private, and carried quietly, like a shadow across a garden, or the hum of an engine at dusk. The nephews' lives remind us that history is shaped not only by those who commit atrocities, but also by those who choose to end them before they can spread further. Paula Hitler's life after the fall of the Third Reich was a study in quiet desperation. The world had moved on from the ashes of war, but for Paula the rubble of history followed her everywhere. Austria, her homeland, seemed familiar yet alien. Streets she once walked freely now whispered accusations and suspicion. She adopted the name Paula Wolf, a careful cloak to hide from both curiosity and judgment. Every piece of paper she signed, every introduction she made, was a subtle act of self-preservation. Working as a secretary in a small office in Linz, Paula earned barely enough to survive. Her fingers typed letters she could not read, handled documents she could not influence. Her days followed a rigid rhythm, early arrival, mindless work, and a quiet exit, trying not to attract attention. Co-workers described her as polite, efficient, and strangely distant, as if each glance at a colleague was a battle to remain unnoticed. Yet, it was during breaks and late afternoons that her true solitude emerged. Paula would stand by the tall windows, gazing at the fading light. She did not watch passers-by or the mundane bustle of the streets. Her eyes searched for ghosts, the invisible companions of a history too heavy to bear. Sometimes she whispered fragments of memory to herself, words that no one could hear, the laughter of her childhood, the shadow of her brother looming larger than life, the fear that had crept into every corner of her family. Journalists occasionally discovered her existence, drawn by curiosity about the Führer's family. They would arrive with questions, notebooks, and cameras, but Paula responded sparingly. One reporter recalled her voice as soft, almost melodic, yet layered with sorrow. "He was my brother. I loved him before the world hated him, but I cannot forgive what he became." Her words were not defiance nor denial. They were a confession of human complexity, love tangled with horror, familial loyalty shackled by the weight of history. Paula never married. She had no children. The war had stolen her youth and reshaped her identity. She became a ghost among the living, moving through the streets of Austria with careful steps, carrying a burden invisible to all but herself. Years passed, and her life became a quiet rhythm of survival. She lingered in small apartments, saved enough for modest meals, and avoided attention at all costs. Her existence was an ongoing negotiation with a world that wanted answers and a past she could never reclaim. She was in every sense a shadow, present yet unseen, connected to history yet detached from it, a witness to crimes she could neither change nor erase. When Paula died in 1960, there were no obituaries, no memorials, no family to mourn. She was laid to rest in a nameless grave, as if to vanish completely into the soil she had always walked upon in silence. Only decades later did historians piece together her final resting place, revealing a simple stone in a quiet cemetery. There were no flowers, no family, only the weight of her solitude and the echoes of a name that would forever haunt history. Paula Wolf's story is not one of heroism or villainy, but of survival. It is a meditation on the shadow of legacy, the suffocating inheritance of guilt, and the unbearable solitude of living in the aftermath of a monster. She lived under a borrowed name, but the mark of history never left her. The years moved slowly for Paula Wolf. Time was measured not by seasons or celebrations, but by the passing shadows in her small apartment and the quiet footsteps in the corridors of her building. Friends were scarce and family non-existent. Every encounter reminded her of the life she had left behind, and every letter that came to her mailbox carried the faint sting of the past she could not escape. She kept few possessions, a worn coat, faded photographs, and letters she rarely read. The memories were constant companions, yet she could never fully acknowledge them. She spoke to no one about her brother's deeds, no one about the weight of a name that had brought death to millions. When someone approached the topic, she would smile faintly, a mask for the emotions she refused to release and quietly retreat. Even in her final years, Paula remained cautious. She avoided newspapers, historical books, and conversations that could link her back to her family. Yet curiosity always followed. Reporters, historians, and occasionally strangers would ask questions. She never refused an answer outright, but her words were careful, precise, and laden with sadness. "I am not my brother," she would whisper, "and yet I carry him everywhere." Her life was one of anonymity, a deliberate erasure. Every day was a negotiation with guilt, a silent penance for sins she had not committed, but could never escape. She would walk through parks at dusk, observing children play, wondering how innocence could exist in a world shaped by cruelty. Her reflection in shop windows and mirrors reminded her constantly. She bore a name that history would never forgive. Paula's death in 1960 was quiet, unmarked, unnoticed by all but a few who had observed her lonely existence. She was buried in a nameless grave, hidden among the grass of a modest Austrian cemetery. There were no flowers, no gravestone etched with her identity, only the faint imprint of a life that had survived silently, in the shadow of history. It was decades later that historians pieced together her resting place. Archival research, personal accounts, and scattered documents finally revealed the simple stone where Paula Wolf lay. The discovery carried no ceremony, no grandeur, only a sober acknowledgement of a life lived quietly under the weight of a monstrous legacy. Paula's story resonates as a cautionary tale. She was neither villain nor hero. She was a witness, a carrier of history's silent burden, a reminder that some names leave indelible marks not through their own actions, but through the shadow of those they are tied to. Her existence was a testament to the psychological cost of inherited guilt and the desperate need for survival in a world that refused to forgive. In the end, Paula Wolf lived, suffered, and died in silence. Her life was her redemption, her penance, and her escape, a life that bore witness to the enduring curse of a name that should have been forgotten but never truly was. The legacy of Adolf Hitler was a shadow that stretched far beyond the walls of the Berlin bunker and the ruins of the Reich. His death did not mark the end of his influence. It merely shifted the weight onto those who bore his blood. William Patrick, Alexander, and Louis, nephews who had survived the war, understood this burden from the moment they drew their first breath. They inherited not only a name but a history of unparalleled atrocity, a name that carried the screams, the fires, and the irrevocable stain of genocide. Living in Long Island, they attempted normalcy. They learned to fish, to repair engines, to tend gardens. Yet even in these ordinary acts, the extraordinary weight of their inheritance pressed down upon them. Every greeting, every casual conversation had the potential to reveal them. A neighbor asking a simple question could shatter the fragile illusion of normal life, and so silence became their shield. They spoke little, laughed less, and moved through the world as if wearing invisible chains. The pact among them was born from guilt as much as from foresight. They swore that their line would end with them, that no child would carry forward the mark of Hitler. It was a decision both horrifying and deliberate, to extinguish a legacy not of their making, but which demanded an answer. They did not allow love, marriage, or desire to interrupt this moral calculus. Each day was a negotiation between instinct and conscience, a balancing act between living and honoring the burden of history. The world outside never forgot. Occasional journalists, historians, or even curious strangers reminded them of the shadow that followed. Letters arrived, questions were asked, and yet the nephews maintained a quiet dignity. "It ends with us," one whispered to a friend, the weight of those words heavier than any battlefield. They understood that the bloodline carried more than life. It carried responsibility, and with responsibility came moral reckoning. Even within their own home, the echoes of the past were constant. Photographs were hidden, family albums locked away, and conversations about their origins carefully avoided. The act of remembering was dangerous, and the act of forgetting was their only sanctuary. Every smile they gave to the outside world was measured, every gesture rehearsed. In private, the shadow of Hitler's face lingered in reflections, in fleeting memories, and in quiet moments before sleep. This curse, however, was not physical. There were no dark powers or ancient rites, only the suffocating, inheritable shame of a world that could never forgive, and a family that could never unburden itself. The nephews knew that the weight of history could crush them if mishandled, and so the decision to end their line was both practical and poetic. By denying life, they denied the potential for further evil. Theirs was a life of quiet heroism, measured not in deeds of valor, but in the courage to live without perpetuating the horrors that their name evoked. Every day they survived, every breath they took was an act of defiance against the legacy that threatened to define them. They chose anonymity, simplicity, and moral discipline, a conscious repudiation of the shadow that loomed over their very existence. And yet, even in their quiet exile, they remained tethered to history. Every moment of peace was punctuated by the echo of a past they could neither escape nor fully embrace. The curse was continuous, suffocating, a reminder that the world does not forgive by default, and that the children of monsters often inherit their burden, whether they will it or not. The nephews lived out their years quietly, avoiding the gaze of a world that remembered every act of their infamous uncle. William Patrick, Alexander, and Louis did not seek recognition. They avoided notoriety. Their lives were intentionally mundane, a testament to a conscious decision. The Hitler name would end with them. No marriages, no children, no continuation, a deliberate self-erasure in the hope that evil could not be born anew. They understood that the weight they carried was not just familial, but symbolic. Every day their silence spoke louder than any words. They tended gardens, fixed cars, and lived ordinary lives, but the extraordinary shadow of history followed their every step. Even mundane choices were moral acts, to live without passing on a legacy that the world could never forgive. In doing so, they became custodians of morality, paradoxically living under the ghost of a tyrant while refusing to perpetuate his bloodline. The world noticed, albeit subtly. Occasional historians, journalists, and curious neighbors whispered about the strange reclusiveness of the Hitler nephews. Their commitment to the pact was evident in their demeanor, their interactions, their absence from society's major events. They became living reminders that history is not merely the record of events, but the inheritance of responsibility. And responsibility for them was suffocating. As decades passed, each of the nephews aged under the invisible chains of guilt and memory. They carried the Führer's shadow not with pride, but with a heavy, unrelenting shame. Yet within that suffocating weight lay a strange kind of redemption. The decision to end the bloodline voluntarily, ensuring that no child would bear the face of evil, and that history would not see the Führer reborn in another generation. Their lives were a penance of their own choosing, an attempt to reconcile existence with the moral impossibility of their inheritance. By the time the last of the three nephews passed away, the Hitler bloodline had quietly ceased. There were no grand ceremonies, no monuments, no public acknowledgement, just the quiet extinguishing of a lineage that once held the world in terror. The act itself was simple, almost invisible, but its significance was profound. Evil had not returned through these veins. The pact had held. The world would never witness the continuation of a name that had wrought unprecedented destruction. In the silence left behind, one could feel the weight of history itself. The empire had fallen in fire, but its shadow lingered over these men long after the flames died. They carried a curse not of supernatural origin, but of moral consequence, a suffocating inheritance that ended not with force or vengeance, but through conscious, painful choice. It was a quiet redemption, the kind history rarely acknowledges, but the kind that matters all the same, and so the Hitler bloodline ended not in violence, not in spectacle, but in silence, the ultimate act of refusal. The family that bore the face of terror chose instead to vanish quietly, leaving the world to remember only what had already been done. Evil had been halted, not by law or sword, but by conscience, and in that quiet decision, perhaps the most profound justice of all was served.